So, what you are now reading came about because of my need to understand important things that are now happening that hadn't happened in my lifetime but have happened many times before that. These things are the result of three big forces and the questions they prompt. Number one, the long term money and debt cycle. At no point in our lifetimes have interest rates been so low or negative on so much debt as they are today. At the start of 2020, more than 10 trillion of debt was at negative interest rates. An unusually large amount of additional new debt will soon need to be sold to finance deficits. This is happening at the same time as huge pension and healthcare obligations are coming due. These circumstances raise some interesting questions for me. Naturally, I wondered why anyone would want to hold debt yielding a negative interest rate and how much lower interest rates can be pushed. I also wondered what will happen to economies and markets when they can't be pushed lower, and how central banks could be stimulative when the next downturn inevitably came. Would central banks print a lot more currency, causing its value to go down? What would happen if the currency that the debt is denominated in goes down while interest rates are so low? These questions led me to ask what central banks will do if investors flee debt denominated in the world's reserve currencies. In other words, the dollar, the euro, and the yen. Which would be expected if the money that they are being paid back in is both depreciating in value and paying interest rates that are so low. In case you don't know, a reserve currency is a currency that is accepted around the world for transactions and savings. The country that gets to print the world's primary currency, now the US, is in a very privileged and powerful position. And debt that is denominated in the world's reserve currency, in other words, US dollar denominated debt, is the most fundamental building block for the world's capital markets and the world's economies. It is also the case that all reserve currencies in the past have ceased to be reserve currencies, often coming to traumatic ends for the countries that enjoyed this special privilege. So I also began to wonder whether, when, and why the dollar will decline as the world's leading reserve currency, and how that would change the world as we know it. Number two, the domestic wealth and power cycle. Wealth values and political gaps are now larger than at any other time during my lifetime. By studying the 1930s and other prior eras when polarity was also high, I've learned that which side wins out, in other words, left or right, will have very big impacts on economies and markets. So naturally, I wondered what these gaps will lead to in our time. My examinations of history have taught me that, as a principle, when wealth and values gaps are large and there is an economic downturn, it is likely that there will be a lot of conflict about how to divide the pie. How will people and policymakers be with each other when the next economic downturn arrives? I am especially concerned because of the previously mentioned limitations on central banks' abilities to cut interest adequately to stimulate the economy. In addition to these traditional tools being ineffective, printing money and buying financial assets, now called quantitative easing, also widen the wealth gap because buying financial assets pushes up their price, which benefits the wealthy who hold more financial assets than the poor. Number three, the international wealth and power cycle. For the first time in my lifetime, the United States is encountering a rival power. China has become a competitive power to the United States in a number of ways and is growing at a faster rate than the US. If trends continue, it will be stronger than the United States in most of the most important ways that an empire becomes dominant. Or at the very least, it will become a worthy competitor. I have seen both countries up close for most of my life, and I now see how conflict is increasing fast, especially in the areas of trade, technology, geopolitics, capital, and economic, political, social ideologies. I can't help but wonder how these conflicts and the changes in the world order that will result from them will transpire in the years ahead and what effects that will have on us all. The confluence of these three factors piques my interest and most draws my attention to similar periods such as the 1930 to 1945 period and numerous others before that. More specifically, in 2008 to 2009, like in 1929 to 1932, there were serious debt and economic crisis. In both cases, interest rates hit 0%, which limited central banks' ability to use interest rate cuts to stimulate the economy. So, in both cases, central banks printed a lot of money to buy financial assets, which in both cases caused financial asset prices to rise and widen the wealth gap. In both periods, wide wealth and income gaps led to a high level of political polarization that took the form of greater populism and battles between ardent social-led populists of the left and ardent capital-led populists of the right. These domestic conflicts stewed while emerging powers, Germany and Japan in the 1930s, increasingly challenged the existing world power. And finally, just like today, the confluence of these factors meant that it was impossible to understand any one of them without also understanding the overlapping influences among them. As I studied these factors, I knew that the short term debt cycle was getting late and I knew that a downturn would eventually come. I did not expect the global pandemic to be what brought it about, though I did know that past pandemics and other acts of nature, like droughts and floods, have sometimes been important contributors to these seismic shifts. To gain the perspective I needed about these factors and what their confluence might mean, I looked at the rises and declines of all the major empires and their currencies over the last 500 years, focusing most closely on the three biggest ones: the US Empire and the US dollar, which are most important now, the British Empire and the British pound, which were most important before that, and the Dutch Empire and the Dutch guilder before that. I also focused less closely on the other six other significant, though less dominant, empires of Germany, France, Russia, Japan, China, and India. Of those six, I gave China the most attention and looked at its history back to the year 600 because, number one, China was so important throughout history, it's so important now, and it will likely be even more important in the future. And number two, it provides many cases of dynasties rising and declining to look at to help me better understand the patterns and the forces behind them. In these cases, a clearer picture emerged of how other influences, most importantly technology and acts of nature, played significant roles. From examining all these cases across empires and across time, I saw that important empires typically lasted roughly 250 years, give or take 150 years, with big economic debt and political cycles within them lasting about 50 to 100 years. By studying how these rises and declines worked individually, I could see how they worked on average in an archetypical way, and then I could examine how they worked differently and why. Doing that taught me a lot. My challenge is in trying to convey it well. Remember that what I don't know is much greater than what I know. In asking these questions from the outset, I felt like an ant trying to understand the universe. I had many more questions than answers, and I knew that I was delving into numerous areas that others have devoted their lives to studying. So I aggressively and humbly drew on knowledge of some remarkable scholars and practitioners who each had in depth perspectives on some piece of the puzzle. though none had the holistic understanding that I needed in order to adequately answer all my questions. In order to understand all the cause effect relationships behind these cycles, I combined my triangulation with historians who specialized in different parts of this big, complicated history, and policymakers who had both practical experiences and historical perspectives, with an examination of statistics drawn out of ancient and contemporary archives by my excellent research team and by reading a number of superb books on history. While I have learned an enormous amount that I will put to good use, I recognize that what I know is still only a tiny portion of what I'd like to know in order to be confident about my outlook for the future. Still, I also know from experience that if I waited to learn enough to be satisfied with my knowledge, I'd never be able to use or convey what I have learned. So please understand that while this study will provide you with my very top down, big picture perspective on what I've learned and my very low confidence outlook for the future, you should approach my conclusions as theories rather than facts. But please keep in mind that even with all of this, I have been wrong more times than I can remember, which is why I value diversification of my bets above all else. So, whenever I provide you with what I think, as I'm doing in this study, please realize that I'm just doing the best I can to openly convey to you my thinking. It's up to you to assess for yourself what I've learned and do what you like with it. How this study is organized. As with all my studies, I will attempt to convey what I learned in both a very short, simple way and in a much longer, more comprehensive way. To do so, I wrote this book in two parts. Part 1 summarizes all that I learned in one very simplified archetype of the rises and declines of empires, drawing from all my research of specific cases. In order to make the most important concepts easy to understand, I will write in the vernacular favoring clarity over precision. As a result, some of my wording will be by and large accurate, but not always precisely so. I will also highlight key sentences in bold so that you can just read these and skip the rest to quickly get the big picture. I will first distill my findings into an index of total power of empires, which provides an overview of the ebbs and flows of different powers, that is constituted from 8 indexes of different types of power. Then I go into an explanation of these different types of power so you can understand how they work, and finally discuss what I believe it all means for the future. Part 2 shows all the individual cases in greater depth, sharing the same indices for all the major empires over the last 500 years. Providing the information this way allows you to get the gist of how I believe these rises and declines work by reading part 1 and then to choose whether or not to go into part 2 to see these interesting cases individually in relation to each other and in relation to the template explained in part 1. I suggest that you read both parts because I expect that you will find the grand story of the evolutions of these countries over the last 500 years in part 2 fascinating. That story presents a sequential picture of the world's evolution via the events that led the Dutch Empire to rise and decline into the British Empire to rise and decline into the US Empire, and the US Empire to rise and enter its early decline into the rise of the Chinese Empire. It also compares these three empires with those of Germany, France, Russia, Japan, China, and India. As you will see in the examinations of each of them, they all broadly followed the script, though not exactly. Additionally, I expect that you will find fascinating and invaluable the stories of the rise and declines of the Chinese dynasties since the year 600, just like I did. Studying the dynasties showed me what in China has been similar to the other rises and declines, which is most everything. Helped me to see what was different, which is what makes China different from the West, and gave me an understanding of the perspectives of the Chinese leaders who all study these dynasties carefully for the lessons they provide. Frankly, I don't know how I'd be able to navigate what is happening now and what will be coming at us without having studied all this history. But before we get into these fascinating individual cases, let's delve into the archetypical case.